And in this session today, Chris McKee and myself will take you through the Logicam's requirements for managing subcontractors and sub-consultants. So the aim of the first part of the session is to give you an understanding of the health, safety, environment and quality requirements in relation to the management of subcontractors or sub-consultants. For the rest of the presentation, I'll just mention subcontractors because it gets too long-winded with subcontractor and sub-consultant every time. The second part of this session will give you an understanding of the procurement and legal requirements. So our objectives today really are to familiarise you with the processes and procedures for working with subcontractors, explain the HSEQ requirements throughout the contract life cycle, inform you of your HSEQ roles and responsibilities whilst involved in the management of subcontractors, and explain the types of risks that we could be exposed to if subcontractors are engaged without pre-qualification. So when we're working with subcontractors, what we've got to bear in mind that it is an important element of our HSEQ management system and hence our accreditation to the quality, health and safety and environment standards, as well as our certifications with Achilles and ISNet World. When project managers are working through the project assurance and delivery of their projects, they need to work with the requirements that are defined in our project delivery manual, in our procurement procedures and in our HSEQ procedures, and the subcontractors have to meet the broader requirements of our HSEQ management system. So what that means is that the subcontractors must have processes and procedures in place which cover similar things to our management system. So they need to cover their leadership, what their risk management procedures are, how they plan, their training and their competency, and how they communicate within their business and ensure that all their health and safety, quality, financial procedures, all of that is in place. If we look in a little bit more detail at the different responsibilities in relation to subcontractor management, the top there you've got the project manager. His responsibilities, or shouldn't be sexist, his or her responsibilities are to contact procurement to ensure that a subcontractor is in the approved subcontractor or vendor register, and that's especially relevant for high-risk work. They need to ensure that the subcontractor is aware of the scope of the work and identify the HSEQ risks throughout the subcontractor life cycle and ensure there's adequate management of any mitigation measures that are put in place. They also need to ensure that the functional support representatives have been identified and engaged. And the project manager is also responsible for monitoring the subcontractor's HSEQ performance. Procurement have to ensure that the subcontractor is pre-qualified and the pre-qualification has been signed off as required by HSEQ, finance and contracts management. Now, whoever is the HSEQ representative on the project works along with the project manager to ensure that any risks associated with the project have been identified and assessed. They will also complete the HSEQ assessment of the subcontractor if they haven't already been signed off, and they will provide support and assistance throughout the life of the project to the project manager at each phase. And legal and contracts, their role and responsibility is to draft the contract, be there for legal advice, and also to help out with dispute and claim support. So, why do we pre-qualify? The reason we do it is to give us an assessment of the subcontractor's HSEQ capability. We also carry out a financial review of the subcontractor and establish appropriate contractual terms and conditions for the work that they're going to be carrying out. The procurement team have a template in the quality management system, which they send out to the subcontractors. And we have a list of those already approved, which is held by procurement. We are updating that, and we have some more subcontractors to add. And we will upload that list onto the intranet in the near future. We'll send out a link to everyone where it is, and they can have a look and see who's pre-qualified, who isn't, and who they feel needs to be on that subcontractor list. Okay, so I put this slide in. This is really kind of just to show you what we send out to the subcontractor, the information that they need to give us. And this is just a very small part of the form. This just covers a bit on the health and safety aspect. So for high risk work, the subcontractor is required to complete an in-depth questionnaire. It covers their health and safety, quality, and environmental procedures, policies, processes, and they have to supply us with certificates of accreditation, if that's applicable, as well as copies of all their procedural documents. The documentation that they send in then needs to be assessed so that we can ensure that they can comply with our HSEQ and financial requirements. Hence, we need people to engage procurement and HSEQ as early as possible in the project to make sure that we've got enough time to gather and assess all this information. So if I now take you through the project life cycle and the requirements for each phase of the project. So during mobilization, the project manager has to ensure that the subcontractor is clear on the expectations and has the capacity to meet the HSEQ requirements. We can do audits of the subcontractors to ensure that they comply with Logicam's requirements. And at the kick-off meeting, as a minimum, we should really include the HSEQ expectation and our policy, a schedule of all the HSEQ activities, a review of the key risk controls and the mitigation plans, what the activities are going to be during mobilization, go through the induction, training and competence of the personnel working on the project, HSEQ performance indicators to confirm with the subcontractor what they are, the emergency response plans, what our incident report and investigation process is, how we will track any non-compliances, and the control of all the work arrangements. During project execution, the subcontractor should be monitored to ensure that they are managing the risk, they're complying with the details from the HSEQ plan, and that they're meeting the agreed KPIs. If they are not meeting the above requirements, the project manager is responsible for taking appropriate intervention action. The HSEQ performance will be reviewed at regular intervals during the project, and the results have to be uploaded into Curator. And any HSEQ audits will be carried out in accordance with Logicam's and the client requirements. During demobilization, you'll have to go through again and ensure that all hazards have been identified and that we have control measures in place for those. And then at the end of the project, this is where we do closeout and evaluation. So the performance should be analysed against the agreed HSEQ plan and the KPIs, and any lessons learned should be captured so we continually improve into the future. Any performance issues that we hadn't already reported should be flagged to HSEQ and procurement. So in summary, during planning, risk assess the scope of the work, decide on the HSEQ accountabilities and the HSEQ schedule. Pre-qualification will give us a capability assessment, a financial assessment, and let us do the identification and establishment of all the contractual terms. During the engagement of the subcontractor, establish the HSEQ criteria, and the subcontractor prepares a risk assessment and their HSEQ plan. During mobilisation, ensure the subcontractor is clear on their expectations and they have a plan in place, and go through the kick-off meeting and ensure that everything that I mentioned in the previous slide, so that's all being covered. During the project execution, work to the plan, supervise and monitor the subcontractor, keep the KPIs in curator. Assurance audits can be carried out by people on the HSEQ team if you need us to come in and carry out audits. And then keep an eye on the performance and any claims management during the project. During demobilisation, again, assess the risks. Make sure there's a risk management plan in place. If the HSEQ plan needs to be updated, and then monitor again during demobilisation. The project closeout and evaluation, report against the HSEQ plan, review the key performance indicators, record the lessons learned and update the HSEQ plans for any future work that'll be done with that subcontractor. So I'll hand over to Chris, and Chris will take you through the rest of the session.
Hi, well, so what we're going to talk about now is some of the risks and exposure that can come up where we're not adhering to the procurement policies or the reasons behind our standards. First up, from our HSE perspective, we're all aware that we have a duty of care to ensure our workers are protected whilst they're carrying out work for this, and this extends down to subcontractors as well. And it's an ethical and moral responsibility that we have beyond the legislative requirements. But from the legislative requirements, there can be severe fines imposed for any workplace injuries that we've found to have caused and haven't had the proper risk measures in place. And there could be personal liability for this in the form of you can be imprisoned if you neglect in your duties in some of the more severe category offences under the legislation. We'll now move on to financial risks. So probably the biggest one from a subcontractor perspective is insolvency. So insolvency is the corporate equivalency of bankruptcy. So it's when you run out of money. And this happens with subcontractors on a reasonable basis. There's normally, on a daily basis, there can be 40 or 50 applications in each of the courts for insolvency. But the big ones that applies for us is when we give free issued goods to subcontractors, if we haven't followed the policies, and there's a number of legislative changes that have happened over the last few years, if we haven't followed the policies properly and registered those items with the applicable registers, when an administrator or a liquidator steps in, they will just seize those assets as part of the collective pool for the company in liquidation, and it can become very difficult to recover those. The next point is once a company has gone into liquidation or there's some sort of issue around solvency, there can be a requirement to have to go, we still got to complete the work under our head contract. So there can be high level of cost getting a third party to come in and fix up the work for somebody else or to take over the work from your original subcontractor. And normally you're looking at least a factor of 3 to 5 times the amount of what the original costs of the projects were. And then if a company's in liquidation, these costs can be extremely difficult to recover as it's generally an unsecured debt or damage that the liquidator is going to try to avoid at all costs having to deal with. Cost control measures, again, we try to get best price possible for the procurement items that we're doing. And again, if we're not following procedures or going where we've got preferred suppliers in place, the costs on a project can increase substantially. Next one with the procedures is with contracts or all our policies and procedures in place. If they're not adhered to, we're giving the subcontractor a way to provide poor quality products or services. And again, this normally results in either equipment issues or defects in the services that we're providing. And again, there's an on-flow cost with this that we'll either have to reperform the work or get an alternative product. And this is going to erode your EBIT on the project substantially very quickly, having to deal with these issues long term. Next one, finally, looking at the contract or the legal aspects of the contract itself. We need to pre-qualify people so we know which company we're dealing with. It's a really common situation where a parent company might have a subsidiary that they do their work through, and particularly with smaller companies, the idea is there's this concept called the corporate veil, and so you can only go for your particular company that you're contracted with. And if you don't set up the contract properly, they can wind up that company very easily, and you can be left holding the can on a job with no recourse to recover from somebody, being that company's now been wound up or in liquidation, unless we have certain measures in place to allow to get guarantees from a head company. The other one is if we don't know who the company is properly, if we were to try to go and enforce a court action, you'd be turned away, being that you haven't correctly identified the party, and the courts are very stringent that you have to know who you're contracting with appropriately before you bring an action. And again, this is a very common technique that's used in litigation quite often, and it can be quite simple, that there's just been a change of ownership or something minor that can create huge changes and problems like this. The next one is personal guarantees, particularly if we have to adhere to somebody else's terms and conditions. They can have these objects called personal guarantees, which is sort of like what I was talking about parent companies before, but it can make you personally liable for the debt, or it can make the directors of our companies personally liable for the debts. These are extremely dangerous documents because they're very, very enforceable by the courts, and they're very easy to create. And so we've got to see these documents and evaluate them and have a consideration of the risk that we're actually taking on. Just about every procurement item or provider that I go through in the last week has had one of these documents in the terms and conditions. And so if we just commence work, sometimes it can be too late to get out of those guarantees. So they're extremely dangerous, so we need to have a chance to review things. Moving on to the next one, breach of the head contract. So there can be specific obligations about what's required in the subcontract under the head contract, and failing to conform with those requirements is a substantive breach of the head contract. So it can put us into breach of the contract and have to pay damages, but it could also put us in the spot of actually causing a fatal breach of the contract and putting us into what they call repudiation, that we can't complete the contract or as per its requirements. This could be extremely detrimental for the business, not just from a reputational point of view, but from a financial point of view. And again, these type of things do come up on a regular basis. It's not something that is just the worst case scenario. These are very common things that come up in court proceedings on a regular basis. And finally, the other one, adherence to the contract is very important, particularly the industry that we play in, being the construction, engineering or mining spaces. There is specific legislation around the building and construction industry, and engineering works falls within the scope of that within most jurisdictions across Australia, that requires payment to occur in certain timeframes or within certain processes. And failing to conform to those processes, or when you have a dispute about something, failing to raise the dispute properly can actually force you to have to make the payment, and you have no statutory or common law rights to question that or challenge that duties. And a classic example is the Queensland Parliament, before it's dissolving into caretaker mode, had just passed a bill that would make the security payment legislation much tougher here in Queensland, to the point of they don't even have to call it a payment claim. An invoice or just a delivery of a statement for payment could be considered one of these payment claims that's specified under the legislation. So it's really important that we're following the mechanisms under the contract properly and disputing our invoices or disputing work that's being done in an applicable and timely manner. So this next one just talks about the roles and responsibility, and this is really a collaborative partnership, and we've made a lot of inroads with this, but essentially the project manager themselves is responsible for the day-to-day operations with their subcontractors. Now, we work hand in hand with that, but you guys know your projects and you know what your subcontractor needs to do from the technical aspect of it. With the procurement / legal contracts aspect of it, we understand the more strategic parts of the business. So we'll do the pre-qualification, we'll negotiate those strategic partnerships, and I'm looking at one of those with NHP now, but we'll also draft the specific contracts, but then we'll hand it across to the project manager, and it's up to you guys to run it. We're there if you need help, or if you don't understand the contract, or you need to make sure you've got your processes right when executing the contract or enforcing the contract. We are there. We're only a phone call away. For specific legal or contractual advice, you can either talk to myself or David Shaw, and that one, and for some of the procurement aspects in terms of getting your POs and the sort raised, that's the procurement function. Finally, there's a couple of key messages to take away from this today, because there has been some changes, but the big one is no work is to commence without a contract or an appropriate arrangement in place. And so when we do part of the pre-qualification scheme, is we set them up so that the vendor or subcontractor will potentially accept our terms, and that way we can release a PO very quickly. Or on the bigger projects, it means having your contract executed. And what I mean by executed is it's signed by both Logicams and the subcontractor, is what contract execution means. It's not just being signed by one side, ready to go. Flora released a directive a couple of weeks ago in terms of projects with $100,000 or more procurement. These have to be cash flow positive. I cannot stress this enough. Projects have to be cash flow positive now from our procurement. So that means either structuring an appropriate payment schedule, so we can receive some form of payment in advance, or we can claim goods as part of the payment progress, or alternatively, it means upfront payments. The only people that can override this, and they will still come to legal contracts for that advice and to procurement, is the CEO, the CFO, the operations managers, or Director of Technology and Innovation, which is Julius. Further on, reviews and drafting of contracts take time. Last minute requests, and I know these come up sometimes, and we will try to be as flexible and as accommodating as we can, and this is why we try to pre-qualify in advance. But putting a subcontract together does take time, and there's usually going to be a negotiation period to go with it. We have to examine the head contract and transfer those risks down to the subcontract. And there's going to be aspects that a subcontract is not going to like, but unfortunately the risk has to be appropriately transferred, so Logicams isn't left holding all the risk for a project. Now we will endeavour to be fair and reasonable, but this has to be balanced. The subcontractor can't have all their own way, and at some times with the negotiation, we have to be prepared to walk away and use somebody else to do it. Otherwise, we're left in a position where we have to take too much risk for a job that we really shouldn't be, that's been carved out to a subcontractor. Finally, subcontracting is about risk management, and we need to consider a number of key aspects to that. Firstly and foremost is the head contract requirements. We've got to transfer the risk down. We can't carry it all. It can be a portion based on what the percentage of the work of the overall head contract will be for the subcontractor, but it has to be proportionate. This means transferring an appropriate liquidated damages down, making sure that any insurance requirements that the subcontractor has them, or we've put effective mitigation processes in where they don't have those insurances, and this can be things like bank guarantees and the like that can help protect against some of this. The scope has to be clear and well defined. At the end of the day, a contract is not just a legal document, but it's a relationship document. You want to be able to go to it and say, well, you agreed to do this for us. It was very clear about what our expectations are. All we're asking you to do is this. Getting contractual shouldn't be seen as a problem. All you're asking them to do is honour a commitment that they made in writing. Cost management, it's got to be right. The old variation bombs were very common in the construction and building industry for a very long time. The contract's there to manage that. A subcontractor shouldn't be trying to win the job purely based on price and then thinking they're going to top it up by variations. We have to be managing it properly and getting value for money, balancing the quality of the result. And finally, we have to reduce the exposure to Logicams, not only just from a legal commercial point of view, but also to our people as much as possible. And there are specific HSE obligations we do put in the contracts to go with that. And we need to manage that appropriately. So just in summary, we'll just talk through the cycle about how it works. So HSEQ is integrated into the early stages of the contracting process. The project manager is trained and held accountable for the performance of HSE on their jobs. The subcontractor needs to be pre-qualified, and so we can see the HSE capability is assessed. We then do the selection process, and this has to be transparent and accountable. Myself, Claire, and the finance team work together to do that for the assessment part of it, in conjunction with the project management or the engineering team to provide us the technical aspects of it. Then in the execution or pre-mobilisation phase, we look at the rigorous HSEQ plans to be developed to ensure that there's adequate protections in place. The work's then executed to our standards. We monitor this via the KPIs the job, and then we have a debrief at the end. So we have a lessons learned and close out. So we can help use this to influence our selection decisions in the future. Finally, if you have any inquiries about procurement-related aspects, there's the email address that goes through our group inbox, or you can give myself or Nilda a call. We prefer that, being that Nilda and I both monitor the inbox, that you use the procurement inbox for email contact, but by all means, please give us a call any other time. And that's it from me. Is there any questions on the presentation that's been given today? Okay, well, if there's no questions, we'll wrap it up there, but please send me an email or drop us a line at any time, and I'll come back to you as best as I can. Thank you very much for your time today. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, guys.